Judge Thomas Klein sat high in his chair, his eyes scanning the room as he prepared to hear the next case, a minor traffic violation. A woman with a calm demeanor was called forward. Her name was Naomi Harris, and as she stepped up to the front, Klein barely glanced at her before turning to paperwork in front of him. He had no reason to think much of her. She was just another person who had broken the law in a small way, a violation that could easily be overlooked. But it wasn't his job to overlook things. The law was the law, and it must be followed strictly. Naomi Harris was tall and poised, dressed in a crisp suit, her hair pulled back neatly. A quiet confidence radiated from her presence. Klein didn't notice how she stood, as if she had been in courtrooms 100 times before. He didn't see the ease in the way she addressed him, as if she were accustomed to negotiating the fine line between authority and reason. No, Klein only saw a defendant, one among many who had come before him in the countless years he had served as a judge. He scanned her paperwork and noted the small infraction she had committed, driving a few miles over the speed limit on a nearly empty highway on a late afternoon. Nothing that screamed danger or recklessness. In fact, he was almost sure he could have let her off with a warning instead of a fine. But something about the way the case was presented rubbed him the wrong way, and despite the small nature of the offense, he couldn't help but feel it was his duty to impose the fine, to remind her that the rules applied to everyone equally. Klein glanced at Naomi as he pronounced the fine, a few $100s, and instructed her to pay within the next month. There was no emotion in his voice, no acknowledgement that he had just fined someone who could very well be an expert in the law herself. Her expression didn't change. In fact, she seemed almost detached, as if she were playing a role in a much larger production, one that involved more than just a traffic ticket. She accepted the fine without hesitation and left the courtroom with the same quiet grace with which she had entered. As the door closed behind her, Klein felt a brief flicker of uncertainty, but quickly dismissed it. He was doing his job after all. No one was above the law, not even someone who might seem more important than the average citizen. As the next case was called, his mind drifted momentarily to the dull thrum of the courtroom, the sound of papers being shuffled, the hum of voices from outside the walls. It wasn't until later that evening, when Klein was sitting in his office reviewing cases for the upcoming week, that the thought of Naomi Harris returned to him like an unexpected gust of wind. He didn't know why, but something about her had seemed different. The way she had carried herself, the quiet composure. He had misjudged her. But how could he have known who she was? Her name wasn't familiar at first glance, but then he remembered he had seen it in a list of faculty members from the local law school. Naomi Harris, a professor of constitutional law, one of the best respected in her field. But why had he not recognized her before when she stood before him in that courtroom? Why hadn't he connected the dots? The realization hit him with a sudden shock. A quiet wave of guilt rushed over him as he remembered how swiftly he had passed judgment on someone without truly seeing them. That night, Thomas Klein sat alone in his dimly lit office, going through case files, his desk cluttered with papers and stacks of legal documents, the weight of the day's decisions settling on him. The quiet hum of the old fan in the corner was the only sound that broke the silence. But despite the normalcy of the room, his mind wasn't focused on the cases in front of him. It kept drifting back to Naomi Harris, her face, her presence, the way she had stood so composed in the courtroom. He couldn't shake the feeling that he had missed something important, something he should have seen but hadn't. He picked up his phone and typed her name into the search bar, curiosity gnawing at him. He had done this countless times with other names, but never before had he felt the need to look deeper into someone like this. But when her name appeared on the screen, his breath caught for a moment. Naomi Harris was not just another citizen who found herself in his courtroom. She was a respected law professor at the local university, someone with decades of experience in constitutional law, someone who had dedicated her life to understanding the very legal system he operated within. Klein leaned back in his chair, staring at the screen as the details about her popped up. The accolades, her extensive background in civil rights, her work on high-profile cases that had made waves in the legal community, it all came flooding, and he remembered hearing her name mentioned in legal circles over the years. But never once had he considered that she might be the same woman standing before him just hours earlier. The realization hit him with the weight of a hammer. He hadn't just fined a random person, he had fined Naomi Harris, a leading figure in the field of law, someone who had taught and mentored young lawyers for years, and someone whose reputation was beyond reproach. Klein ran his hand over his face, feeling a deep sense of embarrassment, a quiet shame that crept up from the pit of his stomach to his chest. What kind of judge had he been, he asked himself. How had he not recognized her? Had his judgment been clouded by something deeper, a subconscious bias, that he couldn't even name, a bias that had led him to see her not as a respected academic, but as just another person to be fined? Klein closed his eyes for a moment, trying to push aside the rising guilt, but it was impossible. He could no longer ignore the reality of what had happened. He had treated her like any other defendant, not considering the fact that she was a person who knew the law far better than he did. He had assumed that because she was standing before him as a defendant that she had somehow done something wrong, that she was just another face in a crowded courtroom, but now he realized just how much he had missed. He felt unsettled as he thought about their brief exchange in the courtroom, how easily he had dismissed her, how her composed demeanor hadn't registered with him as anything more than the norm. She had accepted the fine without a word, without complaint, and now he couldn't help but wonder if that had been part of the reason he had been so quick to judge her. It was almost as if she had been too calm, too professional, and in his mind that meant she wasn't special, that she wasn't above the law. But what if that calmness wasn't a sign of guilt, but of something far more layered, something that Klein had failed to see? He sighed deeply and turned off his computer screen, staring into the darkness of his office. The room, now feeling too small for the weight of his thoughts. Naomi Harris was not just a professor. She was someone who had dedicated her life to understanding the flaws of the very system he upheld. And here, he was someone who had just added to those flaws by failing to see her for who she truly was. As the clock ticked on, Klein made a decision. He knew he had to do something more than simply regret his actions. He had to confront this head-on. But how could he approach her? How could he begin to undo the damage he had unknowingly caused? A few days later, the unexpected happened. Judge Thomas Klein found himself attending a local legal conference, one of those routine events where judges, lawyers, and academics gathered to discuss trends in the law. He usually didn't enjoy these events, preferring the quiet solitude of his chambers to the clamor of crowded hotel ballrooms. But that afternoon, it wasn't the talk of new legal precedents that caught his attention. It was the presence of Naomi Harris. She was standing at the front of the conference room, speaking passionately about the intersection of race and the justice system. Klein had heard her name many times in passing, but had never seen her in person. She had a commanding presence, the kind that drew the attention of everyone in the room. Her voice was calm yet firm, and her words carried a weight that seemed to resonate with the entire audience. Klein stood off to the side, just another face in the crowd, but his attention was focused solely on her. As she finished her speech, the crowd erupted in applause, but Klein barely heard the noise. His mind was racing, the realization that she was the same woman he had found in his courtroom only days earlier still heavy in his thoughts. Naomi moved through the crowd with ease, exchanging words with colleagues, nodding politely to attendees who approached her. Klein watched from a distance, suddenly feeling the full weight of the shame that had started to gnaw at him. He had been so dismissive of her in court, so quick to impose that fine without truly considering who she was. After a few moments, Klein's curiosity won over his hesitance. He could feel his heart pounding as he made his way toward her, unsure of what he would say or how she would react. Naomi spotted him before he could get too close, her eyes locking on his as if she knew exactly who he was. There was no surprise in her gaze, just a quiet acknowledgement. "Judge Klein," she said, her tone neutral but measured. "I didn't expect to see you here." Klein cleared his throat, suddenly feeling very out of place. He had rehearsed this moment in his mind, but now that it was happening, his words escaped him. "Professor Harris," he said, his voice betraying a hint of discomfort. I wanted to speak with you." Naomi raised an eyebrow, clearly curious, but didn't interrupt as he stumbled through his apology. I owe you an apology for what happened in court," he said, his voice tight. "I didn't realize who you were, and I didn't treat you with the respect you deserve. I made a mistake." There was a brief pause, and Klein could see Naomi's eyes soften, though her expression remained largely unreadable. She tilted her head slightly, considering him. "I'm not sure you made a mistake, Judge," she said quietly, the words almost measured. "You did what you thought was right based on the information you had." Klein frowned, confused. "But I should have known better," he insisted. "I didn't even think about who you are, what you do. I saw a name, and I made a judgment. I didn't see Naomi. I didn't see the person in front of me." Naomi studied him for a moment, her gaze steady. "I think that's the problem," she said slowly. "You didn't see me, and maybe more importantly, you didn't see the system you're a part of. The system you're upholding without questioning it." The words stung, though Naomi didn't say them with malice. She spoke them like a truth that needed to be acknowledged. Klein shifted uncomfortably, but didn't look away. The room around them continued to buzz with conversation, but in that moment, it felt as though the space had narrowed down to just the two of them. Naomi continued, her voice calm yet piercing. "You're part of a system that's designed to treat people the same, but it doesn't always work that way," she said. "Sometimes people don't see the whole picture. Sometimes people like me get caught in it." Klein opened his mouth to respond, but found himself struggling for the right words. Naomi wasn't angry. She wasn't attacking him. She was simply stating facts, ones that had been staring him in the face for years, but which he had never truly seen. She had been right there in his courtroom, and he had missed everything. Every nuance, every bit of the person standing in front of him. Naomi gave him a small, almost imperceptible nod. "It's not about the fine, Judge," she said, her voice softening just slightly. "It's about seeing people for who they truly are. And maybe for the first time, I'd like to be seen." Klein stood there, lost for a moment, as the weight of her words settled over him. She had spoken without anger or bitterness, but her words were as sharp as any courtroom argument. He had no idea how to respond, but he knew one thing. This was not a conversation that would be easily forgotten. Something had shifted, and he wasn't sure where it would lead, but he knew he had a long road ahead if he was going to make things right. That night, Judge Thomas Klein sat alone in his office, the usual piles of paperwork scattered across his desk, but none of it seemed to matter. His thoughts were consumed by the conversation he'd had with Naomi Harris earlier that day. Her words had echoed in his mind, louder than any case he had ever adjudicated, more unsettling than any verdict he had ever delivered. It wasn't just what she had said, it was the way she had said it, the quiet authority in her voice, the certainty in her eyes. He couldn't stop replaying the moment when she had told him that the problem wasn't the fine, it was the system he was part of. Klein leaned back in his chair, running a hand over his face. He had always prided himself on being impartial, fair, and just. He had been taught that a judge's role was to apply the law without bias, without emotion, without consideration for anything other than the facts before him. But now, everything he thought he knew felt hollow, like a structure built on shaky ground. For the first time in years, Klein didn't feel like he was in control of his own thoughts. He stared at the papers in front of him, but his mind kept drifting back to Naomi, to the calm yet piercing way she had spoken to him, not as a defendant, but as someone who saw the cracks in the very system he believed in. She hadn't just questioned his actions, she had questioned the entire foundation of his role in the court system, the assumptions he had carried for years. He turned on his desk lamp and reached for one of the books Naomi had recommended, the one about racial bias in the justice system. He opened it slowly, as if expecting the pages to jump out at him, but after a few minutes of reading, it was clear that the ideas inside were far more complex than he had anticipated. He felt overwhelmed. The text was dense with theories and case studies, historical examples of systemic injustice that he had long been aware of but never fully understood. He had heard about such issues in passing, but had always dismissed them as distant problems, things that didn't directly affect his courtroom. But now, Naomi's words hung in the air between him and these ideas, forcing him to confront them head-on. The more he read, the more Klein felt like a man standing at the edge of a cliff, staring down into an abyss of uncomfortable truths. There was a part of him that wanted to shut the book and ignore it all, to go back to the familiar, the simple certainty of black and white rulings. But there was another part of him, the part that had been shaken by Naomi's quiet challenge, that refused to look away. The system he had served for so many years was flawed, and he had been a part of it, perpetuating it without even realizing how deep the biases ran. It wasn't just about race, he realized. It was about everything. The way he had viewed people who came before him in court, the way he had assumed he knew what was best for them. Naomi had been right. He hadn't seen her, not truly. He hadn't seen the humanity behind the person standing before him. He had seen an image, a symbol of authority in a courtroom, someone who could easily be dismissed as just another defendant in a long line of cases. But she was more than that, far more than that. And now Klein understood that he had to start seeing people in a different way. He had to challenge himself to confront the unconscious prejudices that shaped his decisions every day. He couldn't go back to the way things had been. The hours passed, and Klein found himself marking passages in the book, taking notes, trying to understand the deeper implications of what he was reading. He couldn't help but feel a growing sense of responsibility, but it was a heavy burden, one that threatened to suffocate him with its weight. Yet in that discomfort, there was also a flicker of something new, a desire for change. The clock on his wall ticked past midnight, and Klein sat there, eyes bleary from reading, but his mind was alive with the realization that he had a long road ahead. The easy path, the one where he blindly enforced the law without questioning it, was no longer an option. He had to find a way to make things right, to see people as they truly were, to see beyond the surface. He closed the book with a quiet snap, the decision already forming in his mind. There was only one person who could help him now. He had to reach out to Naomi again, not just to apologize, but to learn from her, to confront the truths he had spent his life ignoring. He picked up his phone, his fingers hesitating for a moment over the keys. Then he typed the message. Professor Harris, I'd like to meet again. I think I'm beginning to understand what you were trying to say. Would you be willing to talk more about how we can change the system from within? As he hit send, he felt a small sense of relief, as if taking this first step might lead him out of the fog of guilt and uncertainty. It was a small move, but it was a start. And for the first time in a long while, Klein felt like he was on the path towards something better, something that might lead to real change, not just for himself, but for the system he had served for so long. The next week, Thomas Klein found himself standing outside a small cafe in the heart of the city. It was a place he'd never been before, tucked away on a quiet street corner. He had chosen it deliberately, hoping the calm atmosphere would provide a neutral space for what he had to do. He had reached out to Naomi Harris the night before, asking to meet again. Her response had been brief but polite. I'll meet you tomorrow at 3 p.m. Cafe on Main Street. We can talk. Klein had spent the hours leading up to the meeting running over his words in his mind. He knew this conversation was inevitable. The weight of his guilt demanded it, but the fear of what might come next still lingered. What could he say to make things right? What could he do to undo the mistake he had made? When Naomi walked into the cafe, her presence seemed to shift the air around her. She was dressed simply but with an elegance that felt effortless. Her gaze landed on him immediately, and though she didn't smile, there was no trace of hostility in her expression either. Just a quiet acknowledgement, as if she had known this meeting was coming long before he had. Judge Klein, she said with a slight nod, her voice cool but not unkind. I'm glad you reached out. Klein rose from his chair and extended his hand, feeling the weight of his actions pressing down on him even more. Thank you for agreeing to meet with me, he said, his voice carrying the hint of something deeper than just formality. I've been thinking about what you said, about what I did. Naomi sat down, her movements deliberate and calm. I'm listening, she said, leaning back slightly in her chair. She didn't push him to speak, didn't rush him to get to the point. She simply waited, as if she already knew he needed time to gather his thoughts. Klein took a deep breath and sat down opposite her, suddenly feeling the weight of everything he had been carrying over the past week. I made a mistake in court, he began, choosing his words carefully. I didn't recognize who you were, and more importantly, I didn't recognize the impact of my decision. I didn't see you for who you truly are. I didn't see the person, Naomi. the teacher, the advocate for justice. He paused, feeling the tightness in his chest. I just saw another person who had broken the law, and I applied the rules without question, without understanding, without seeing how the system I've spent my life upholding might have failed you. Naomi didn't interrupt him. She just sat there, her eyes steady as she listened. It wasn't the angry confrontation Klein had feared. It was something much more profound, as if she were waiting for him to understand on his own terms. I was so focused on enforcing the law, he continued, his voice tinged with regret, that I didn't stop to think about the context of the people I was judging, about their lives, their experiences, their struggles. I didn't see you, Naomi. I just saw a case, and that's not enough. I see that now. Naomi's expression softened, but there was still a distance in her eyes. It's easy to forget, she said quietly, especially when you've spent your life in a position of authority, when you're used to thinking that the law can fix everything. But the law isn't blind, Judge Klein. It's shaped by history, by power, by bias. It's shaped by the very people who enforce it. Klein winced at her words, though they were not harsh. They were simply the truths he had ignored for too long. He had always believed in the fairness of the law, that the system, despite its flaws, was the best mechanism for justice. But Naomi's words were beginning to erode that belief, making him question whether the system was ever fair in the first place. I know, he said softly. I've been reading about it, about the biases that exist, even when we don't recognize them. I didn't realize how deep they went, and now I feel like I'm part of the problem. Naomi's gaze softened, but there was still an edge to her voice. That's the first step, Judge. Recognizing it, seeing it, but that's only the beginning. You have to act on it, too. You have to change how you operate in that courtroom. How you make decisions. Klein nodded, his heart pounding. I don't know how to start, he admitted, feeling the weight of the challenge before him. I don't know how to fix something this big. Naomi leaned forward slightly, her eyes locking onto his. You start by listening, by truly listening, not just to the facts, but to the people who come before you. You start by questioning every assumption you've ever made. You start by understanding that the law doesn't always serve justice and that the people you judge are more than just their cases. Klein swallowed, feeling the gravity of her words. And then Naomi said, you make the changes. Slowly, but surely. It's a long road, Judge. And it's not easy, but you have to be willing to walk it. Klein sat back, feeling both overwhelmed and strangely relieved. The road ahead would be difficult, but Naomi had shown him a path forward. He wasn't sure he was ready, but he knew he had to try. For the first time in a long while, he felt like he might have a chance to make a real difference. Thank you, he said quietly, his voice filled with sincerity, for giving me this chance to see things differently. I won't forget it. Naomi gave him a small, almost imperceptible nod, her gaze never leaving his. I hope you don't. In this part, Klein and Naomi have a heartfelt confrontation where Naomi challenges him to confront not just his actions, but the larger system that shapes those actions. Klein's vulnerability and willingness to change mark a turning point in his character arc. Let me know if you'd like any adjustments or further development. The following weeks felt like a blur to Judge Thomas Klein. He had left that meeting with Naomi Harris determined to change, to listen, to learn, and to see people for who they truly were, not just as cases in his courtroom. But putting that intention into practice wasn't as simple as he had hoped. Each day, as he sat at the bench, the familiar rhythm of his courtroom settled over him like a heavy blanket. The sound of footsteps, the shuffle of papers, the quiet murmur of the court attendees. It was also routine, so ingrained, that for the first few days, Klein found himself slipping back into old habits. He caught himself focusing on the technicalities of cases, how to apply the law without deviation, how to issue fines and rulings that fit within the parameters of legal precedent. The old comfort of authority, of making decisions without hesitation, crept back in. But each time he felt that familiar tug, a small voice inside him reminded him of Naomi's words. Asterisk, you have to listen. You have to see beyond the surface, asterisk. He remembered her challenge. Asterisk, question every assumption you've ever made, asterisk. And so, Klein began to listen more carefully. When a defendant walked into his courtroom, instead of immediately assuming guilt or negligence, he took a moment to look at them, to really see them. He noticed the tired eyes of a young man who had been caught in a minor theft, not just a criminal, but someone who seemed worn out by life's struggles. He noticed the trembling hands of a woman facing a domestic violence charge, not just a perpetrator, but someone who might have been caught in an endless cycle of trauma. At first, it felt awkward. His questions seemed clumsy, too probing, like he was trying too hard to see people beyond their offenses. But as the days passed, something subtle began to shift. He found himself asking about their backgrounds, their circumstances, their lives outside the courtroom. He noticed things he hadn't seen before. The child support case where the defendant was clearly struggling with mental health issues, the traffic violation where the driver explained in a quiet voice that she had been rushing to get to her sick mother's bedside. Klein wasn't letting anyone off easy. He still had to enforce the law, after all, but he found himself issuing sentences that felt more just, more tailored to the circumstances of each individual case. Instead of a blanket fine or a generic sentence, Klein started to offer solutions that took into account the larger picture. A referral to mental health counseling, a temporary reduction in fines for those facing financial hardship, a chance to attend a restorative justice program rather than jail time. It wasn't perfect. Sometimes he still felt the weight of his biases trying to creep back in. Old patterns, old ways of thinking. But Naomi's voice was always there, steady and clear in his mind. Asterisk, you have to change how you operate in that courtroom. Asterisk. And so he kept pushing forward, kept challenging himself, even when it felt like it was easier to fall back into the old ways. One afternoon, after a particularly intense session, Klein found himself walking down the courthouse steps when he spotted Naomi in the distance. She was standing near the entrance of a coffee shop, talking to a colleague. When she saw him, she excused herself and walked over, her expression unreadable but not unkind. "How's it going?" she asked, her voice casual but with an underlying seriousness. Klein took a moment before answering. The truth was, he hadn't expected to feel any different after just a few weeks of trying to change. It wasn't like flipping a switch. But when he spoke, he found the words came easily. "It's harder than I thought," he admitted. "I've been trying to change how I see people, how I rule. And I've made some mistakes, but I think I'm getting better at it. I'm starting to really understand what it means to be just." Naomi gave him a small nod, her expression softening ever so slightly. "It's a process," she said. "You won't get it all right immediately. But what matters is that you're trying. That you're willing to see the system for what it is, and more importantly, to see the people who come before you for who they truly are." Klein looked down at the steps they were walking on, feeling the weight of the responsibility he now carried. It was one thing to acknowledge that the system was flawed, but it was another to take steps to correct it, especially when those steps led him into uncharted territory. "It's not just about me anymore, is it?" he said, almost to himself. "It's about the people who come before me, about the lives I've been impacting." "No," Naomi replied, her voice steady. "It's about seeing them for who they really are, not as cases or statistics. It's about changing the system from the inside. That's how real justice happens." For a moment, they walked together in silence, the weight of her words settling around them. Klein wasn't sure if he was ready to completely reform the system or if he could ever fully undo the mistakes of the past, but he did know one thing. He had started something that couldn't be taken back, and that was enough for now. The road ahead would be long, filled with challenges and missteps, but for the first time in his life, Klein felt like he was on the right path, a path that might not just change him, but the very system he had sworn to serve. It had been several months since Klein's initial meeting with Naomi Harris, and while the journey had been far from easy, he had made significant strides in his personal and professional transformation. His judgment had become more nuanced, and he had begun to understand the human stories behind the cases that came before him. Yet, despite his progress, he knew he was still on shaky ground. He was still learning, still grappling with his place in the system and what it meant to truly administer justice. That was put to the test one morning when a case arrived on his docket that struck a nerve like none before it. A young black man, Marcus Jenkins, stood accused of assault. The charge was a serious one, but the details were complicated. Marcus had been in a heated argument with a store owner over a disagreement about a late payment for a product, and the altercation had escalated. According to the police report, the situation had turned physical when Marcus shoved the owner. But what wasn't mentioned in the report was the fact that Marcus had a history of domestic abuse, an abuse that had been perpetrated against him. Klein had read through the file before entering the courtroom, and the case struck him as eerily familiar. He had seen the cycle of trauma, the kind of violence that was often passed down like an inherited wound. He knew that the system was rarely kind to people like Marcus, especially young black men who found themselves caught in situations where their anger was misinterpreted as aggression. And yet, Klein also knew that the law had to be applied impartially, that there could be no exceptions, no favoritism. The law was clear. Marcus had pushed the store owner, and he had to be held accountable. But Naomi's voice echoed in Klein's mind. Asterisk, you have to see beyond the surface. You have to understand what's driving people to act the way they do, asterisk. As the trial began, Klein could feel the tension rising in the courtroom. Marcus sat at the defense table, looking smaller than Klein had imagined, his hands trembling as he stared at the floor. He was wearing a suit that didn't quite fit, his eyes red as though he hadn't slept in days. The prosecutor presented the evidence, surveillance footage of the altercation, testimonies from witnesses who saw the argument escalate. There was little to challenge the claim that Marcus had shoved the store owner, but as the defense attorney spoke, Klein's attention shifted. The defense lawyer called Marcus to the stand, and his testimony revealed a different side to the story. He spoke about his childhood, his experience growing up in a neighborhood plagued by violence, about the abuse he had endured at the hands of his father, and the overwhelming pressure he felt trying to support his family while keeping his own anger in check. He admitted that the confrontation with the store owner had spiraled out of control, but he also made it clear that his actions had been a product of a lifetime of trauma, of years of learning to survive in an environment that offered him no other tools but violence. Klein could feel his chest tightening as he listened. He knew the facts were clear. Marcus had committed an act of physical aggression, but the context was undeniable. This wasn't just a simple assault, it was a manifestation of deeper issues that society had failed to address. Marcus wasn't a violent person by nature. He was a victim of a system that had systematically failed him. As the trial proceeded, Klein felt the weight of his role more than ever. The law demanded that he sentence Marcus for the assault, but he also knew that any punishment that didn't address the root cause of Marcus' behavior would only perpetuate the cycle of violence. Finally, after hearing both sides, it was time for closing arguments. Klein's thoughts were in turmoil as he prepared to deliver his verdict. He could see the eyes of the spectators on him, the expectations of the community pressing in on him. There were those in the room who wanted him to be strict, to show that the law could not be bent or softened. But Klein was no longer sure that adhering strictly to the law, without understanding the context, was justice at all. When it was his turn to speak, Klein stood up, the gavel resting in his hand, his voice quiet but firm. Marcus Jenkins, he began, what occurred in this courtroom has brought to light more than just an assault. It has revealed the devastating effects of generational trauma and the failure of systems meant to protect you. This court recognizes that your actions were not simply the result of personal aggression, but of years of suffering and survival in a system that has left you no room to heal. There was a brief pause as Klein looked out at the room, at the faces of the people watching him. The law requires accountability, but justice requires more. Marcus, I am not going to sentence you to the usual punishment. Instead, I am ordering that you undergo trauma counseling, anger management therapy, and community service aimed at giving back to the community you've been a part of. This sentence is designed not only to acknowledge the harm you've caused, but to offer you the chance to break free from the cycle of violence that has defined your life. The room was silent. Klein could feel the eyes of everyone on him, but he didn't falter. He had made a decision not just based on the law, but on humanity, on understanding the person in front of him. He didn't know if it would be the right decision in the eyes of everyone, but in his heart, he knew it was the only decision he could make. It was a step toward real justice. Marcus looked up at him, tears in his eyes, and nodded slowly, the weight of the moment settling over him. For the first time, he felt seen. Months had passed since Judge Klein's decision in the Marcus Jenkins case, and though the echoes of that day still lingered, something had shifted inside him. The courtroom no longer felt like just a place for enforcing laws. It had become a space where he could seek true justice, not just for the law itself, but for the people who stood before him. Klein had taken the first steps on a path that wasn't always clear, but it was a path that led him to confront the uncomfortable truths about the system, his role in it, and the lives it affected. The reaction to his decision in Marcus's case had been mixed. Some colleagues had applauded his courage to think outside the traditional sentencing framework. Others had criticized him, arguing that his decision was a betrayal of the law and that the sentence lacked the rigor required for a criminal act. But Klein didn't regret his choice. The change in his approach had been profound, and though the system was slow to adapt, he knew it had to start with individuals. It had to start with him. That afternoon, Klein was walking through the courthouse lobby when he saw Naomi again. She was waiting for him, leaning casually against a pillar, a knowing look in her eyes. There had been no formal follow-up after their last meeting, but Klein knew she had been keeping an eye on his progress. Judge Klein, Naomi greeted him with a small smile. I heard about the Marcus Jenkins case. That was quite a decision. Klein hesitated before answering. He still wasn't entirely sure how to process the reactions to his ruling. It hadn't been easy, and at times, he had wondered if he had made the right call. But when he spoke to Naomi, it felt like talking to someone who understood the complexities of the situation, someone who wouldn't judge him for his doubts. I won't lie, Klein said, his voice weary but steady. It wasn't easy. It's one thing to read about systemic injustice in a book. It's another to apply it in real life. People want clear answers, black and white decisions, but there's no such thing when it comes to human lives, is there? Naomi's smile deepened and she nodded. No, there's always a gray area, and that's where real justice happens. You're learning, Judge, but you're also teaching. You're showing the rest of the system that it can evolve, that it doesn't have to be as rigid as people think. Klein ran a hand through his hair, feeling a slight ache in his chest. I've made mistakes. I still don't know if I'm doing enough. I look around at this courthouse, at the people I work with, and I wonder if they understand what I'm trying to do. I'm not sure I can change everything, Naomi. She regarded him for a moment, then stepped closer, her voice soft but firm. You don't have to change everything, not right away. But you've already changed one life, for Marcus Jenkins, for the people who are affected by the decisions you make. And that's how change begins. It's slow. It's messy. But it's real. Klein looked at her, feeling the weight of her words settle over him. I don't think I can ever go back to the way I was, he said almost to himself, and I don't want to. Naomi's expression softened. You've already crossed the threshold. Now it's about consistency, about not giving up when things get tough, and don't let others sway you from the path you've chosen. This system needs people like you, Judge. There was a brief silence between them, and Klein felt a small weight lift from his shoulders. The uncertainty hadn't disappeared entirely, but he now had a deeper conviction, a belief that he was moving in the right direction. I think I'm starting to understand what you meant, Klein said, meeting her gaze. This isn't just about individual cases. It's about seeing the bigger picture, the people, their lives, their stories. It's about changing the system from the inside, one decision at a time. Naomi smiled, her eyes filled with quiet approval. Exactly. And there will be times when you'll doubt yourself. You'll wonder if it's worth it. But those are the moments when you need to dig deeper. The system is bigger than any one person, but individuals, like you, are the ones who can shape it. You just have to be willing to stand up for what's right, even when it's hard. Klein took a deep breath, his heart steadying as he absorbed her words. Thank you, Naomi, for everything. I don't think I'd be here thinking this way if you hadn't challenged me. Naomi shrugged, her smile gentle. I just gave you the tools. You've done the hard work. Now it's your turn to carry it forward. Klein watched her walk away, her words lingering in his mind like a quiet call to action. He knew that the road ahead wouldn't be easy. He would continue to face difficult cases, and there would be moments when the weight of his decisions felt unbearable. But he also knew that he was no longer the same man who had handed down fines without thought, who had been blind to the impact of his rulings. He was a judge who saw people for who they were, flawed, struggling, but capable of change. As he walked back to his chambers, Klein felt a renewed sense of purpose. His work wasn't finished, and perhaps it never would be. But with each case, each decision, each challenge, he was one step closer to the kind of justice he had always hoped the system would provide. For the first time in his career, Judge Klein felt like he was truly part of the solution, not just as an enforcer of the law, but as a part of the larger fight for fairness, compassion, and real justice. In this final part, Klein reflects on his transformation, finding clarity and conviction in his new role as a judge. Naomi's guidance has helped him realize the deeper purpose of his work, and though the road ahead will still be challenging, Klein is committed to continuing his journey of change. The story ends with hope, progress, and a renewed sense of responsibility. Let me know if you need further adjustments or if you'd like to discuss any other elements of the story.